Okay, so welcome. I'm Professor David Brodsky. I'm the chair of the Department of Judaic Studies at Brooklyn College. We're excited to have you all here for this great lecture on a timely topic. Sorry, I'm also the bouncer, so I'm also letting people in as I'm speaking right now. Our department is launching some new initiatives, so stay tuned. We hope to have quite a few lectures and other events next year that we're getting ready with. And I want to introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Sharon Flado, who's professor of early modern Jewish history, who will now introduce our speaker.
So first of all, we're very excited that you're all joining with us. Zoom has afforded us these kind of opportunities, so there is some silver lining in this strange period we're in. And it's really my honor to introduce David Fishman, who is a colleague and a family friend. And, you know, he's really the scholar, as you'll see. I had to dig a little bit to see where he wrote that he earned his PhD from Harvard, but because that seems to be hidden, but I know that he did. He's a professor at JTS of modern Jewish history, has many students. In addition to that, he serves as the director of Project Judaica, which is important for tonight's talk because it's JTS's program in the Ukraine, based in Kiev, which we now all know how to pronounce, at the Academy in the Kiev University. He also directs the Jewish Archival Survey, which publishes guides to Jewish materials in the archives of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. He also speaks a lot of these languages. He's the author of numerous books on the history and culture of East European Jewry. His most recent book, it's too bad we're not selling it afterward. The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis has been hailed as monuments men for book lovers and first-rate scholarship that pulses with the beat of a most human heart. Not surprisingly, he was awarded the National Jewish Book Award for that book. He's also the former editor-in-chief of Yivo Blätter. He's a serious Yiddishist, some of you know, might come out in the talk, which is the Yiddish language scholarly journal of the Yivo Institute. And he is also a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the list goes on, but I do not want to take away from David Fishman's talk. So without further ado, we're going to hear from Professor Fishman, who's going to enlighten us this evening.
Thank you, Professor Flato, and thank you, Professor Brodsky. And thank you, good evening, everybody, wherever you may be, for joining this evening. The title that actually we agreed upon was, I think, the past, present, and future of the Ukrainian Jewish community. That's a tall order in 40 or 45 minutes, but I'll do my best. I have slides I want to show. I'll go back and forth between images and you seeing me. But I do want to begin sort of in a personal way, and by showing you this picture. The girl on the left is my grandmother, is my father's mother, my Baba Sonia, who grew up she was born in a small shtetl, though it's famous to some, Ostropolye. If you've heard of the stories of Herschel of Ostropolye, she was born in Ostropolye, but then they moved to a bigger city, to Stary Konstantinov, which is in the Volyn region of Ukraine. And probably thanks to my relationship with my grandparents, I became a historian of East European Jewry, and went on to study Russian, Yiddish I had from home. And as Sharon mentioned, I've been traveling to Russia and Ukraine for the last, well, embarrassed to say 30 years. Originally much more to Russia, and then since 2014, only to Ukraine. I guess I grew up with the stereotypes that most people have, most Jews have, which is that Ukrainians are anti-Semites. And, but both through my academic work and through my personal experience, I've learned to have a much more nuanced and complicated image of the history of the Jews in Ukraine. I think lay people often just think the history of Jews in Ukraine is the history of pogroms and the history of massacres and the history of, and that is very unfortunate. And I want to address that question first. I'm going to talk historically, then I'm going to move to the very recent past, meaning before the war started, what Jewish life was like in Ukraine till a month ago. And then something about what's happening literally right now in the war. I will not cover the future. I'm a historian, but not a prophet. Let me begin by, again, addressing this kind of common image. Let me see if I can move this. I think if, again, for Jews, when they think Ukraine, they think of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And when Jews think of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, they think of what's called Gzerot Tach V'Tat, Gzeres Tach V'Tat, the massacres of 1648 and 1649. If they know more, especially if their parents are Holocaust survivors or grandparents are Holocaust survivors, they heard something about Ukrainian collaboration in the Holocaust. They may have heard of the pogrom in Lvov in 1941. They may have heard of Ukrainian nationalists murdering Jews in that summer of 1941, or even beyond, as members of the auxiliary police. And you can pile on. People may have heard something about pogroms in 1881, and they've heard of Babi Yar. I want to respond to this image of Ukrainian Jewish history on many levels. First of all, some of these massacres happened in Ukraine, but have nothing to do with Ukrainians. The pogroms of 1881, or for that matter, pogroms in 1905, 1906, those are Russian affairs. Those were in fact Russian patriotic pogroms against Jews, and they just happened to happen geographically in Ukraine, but they have nothing to do with Ukrainians or Ukrainian history. Babi Yar is overwhelmingly a massacre perpetrated by the Germans, though there was some participation in the organization by Ukrainian auxiliary police, but that is a German massacre of Jews, not a Ukrainian massacre of Jews. Nonetheless, there is a history of Ukrainian violence against Jews. The problem with this is, first of all, it sort of cherry picks and it telescopes. In other words, you pick out these years, 1648, 1941, and you sort of create this image as if Ukrainian Jewish history is some kind of never-ending pogrom going on from year to year to year. But in fact, there were decades and even sometimes centuries between one massacre and then the next massacre. We tend to create this catastrophic image of Jewish history in Ukraine, which is not true. There was a lot of creativity in Ukrainian Jewish history and a lot of coexistence in Ukrainian Jewish history. Let me just talk about the coexistence, which often gets overlooked. There are a lot of Ukrainian words in the Yiddish language. A lot of Slavic words people think come from Russian or come from Polish actually entered Yiddish through Ukrainian. There are bilingual Yiddish Ukrainian songs that Jews sang for generations, meaning Jews knew some Ukrainian. There are shared melodies in the musical repertoire. There are shared foods and dishes. And the point of all of this, if you look in the cultural arena, you see a lot of cross-fertilization between Jews and their Ukrainian neighbors. The point of this is that doesn't happen if there's a history only of hostility or fear, and Jews, keep to themselves and don't interact. These kind of linguistic and musical and other cultural interactions show two communities that live side by side in a complicated relationship, but it is not a relation, but it is a relationship that vacillates between friendship, familiarity, and fear and hostility. That's hard for most people actually to get. Second of all, there's tremendous creativity and richness to Ukrainian Jewish history. And here I want to take you, okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. I'll come back to World War. Well, you know what? Let me go back and discuss World War II, because I think a very strong imprint on popular Jewish memory is Ukrainian collaboration in the Holocaust. And it is undeniable for anyone who looks at the historic record, and you can read John Paul Himka's book on Ukrainian national Holocaust, that Ukrainian nationalists participated and instigated massacres in the summer of 1941. However, what's so interesting to me is there is another history, an opposite history, and most American Jews don't even think about it or know about it, which is that millions of Ukrainians fought on the other side of the war. That is, they fought in the Red Army against the Nazis. Close to, and that's this slide. This is a Ukrainian division in the Red Army. 1.5 million Ukrainians died in combat in World War II fighting the Nazis. 1.5 million. What's quite amazing about that is that has not sunk into Jewish consciousness because we have our memories from Polish Jews and not from Soviet Jews. But if you talk to Soviet Jewish war veterans from the Red Army from World War II and you ask them, and what about the Ukrainians? And I've asked them that question. They say, oh, dobry chłopcy, really nice guys. There is a mixed and complicated history as far as Ukrainians in World War II, but many, many, many more Ukrainians fought the Nazis than collaborated with the Nazis. And here I wanted to show you an interesting sort of anecdote that, yes, it's the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz. 5 or 10 years ago, the Russians, who are very proud of the Red Army's liberation of Auschwitz, wanted to highlight this by interviewing the very first Red Army soldier to enter Auschwitz when it was liberated. They did a little digging, a little research, and they were deeply disappointed because the very first Red Army soldier to enter and liberate Auschwitz wasn't Russian. He was Ukrainian, and they dropped that propaganda project immediately. Now, let me give you a little tour of Ukraine. We see this, but from the perspective of Jewish history. We see this map every night on TV in one form or another, but now I want you to look at this map through different eyes, the eyes of a Jewish historian. Jewish migration in Eastern Europe starts in the West and keeps moving over the centuries to the East. So that Lviv, which has many names, in Ukrainian it's Lviv, in Russian it's Lvov, in Polish it's Lvov, and in German and in Yiddish it's often referred to as Lemberg. So it's a hard city because it got so many names. But Lvov, Lemberg is one of the oldest it is the oldest Jewish community in the territory of today's Ukraine. It goes back to the 1300s. Whereas, for instance, just to move you the other way, if you go to Kharkov, this is one of the newer communities in Ukrainian Jewish history. It was established in the mid 1800s. So that's a 500-year gap, almost a thousand years, 500 years between when this city was had a Jewish community and when this city had a Jewish community. Lvov was a great center of Jewish rabbinic learning. The Rabbi David Halevi, who wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, David Halevi wrote a book called the Taz, or the Torah Zahav, which is a classic of rabbinic learning. It's still studied today in yeshivas and academies. He lived in Lvov, and the synagogue built afterwards was named after him as the Taz Shul. And Lvov was also one of the earliest centers of Hebrew printing, going back to the 1500s, and produced a lot of Hebrew books. If we move further into this area is what you may hear of Zhytomyr, which sometimes is in the news these days. This region, which is known as Volyn and Podolia, this is the heartland of the Hasidic movement. You can't see them because they're small towns, but the town of Mezhbizh, where the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, Israel Baal Shem Tov, lived and led a group of disciples for 25 years. Mezhbizh is right in here. Not far over here is the town of Berdichev, with another famous Hasidic master, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. And Berdichev is interesting because it's the most Jewish city or town probably in all of Eastern Europe. Berdichev grew at its peak. They had 50,000 inhabitants, so it's not quite a town. It's like the size of a city. And 80% of the inhabitants of Berdichev were Jewish. So there's really no other place that size where you have 80% of a CD being Jewish. It is the paradigmatic Jewish city in Eastern Europe, is Berdichev. Shalom Aleichem writes about it, write about it. Moving down here to Odessa. This is the most famous center of the modern Jewish intelligentsia. If Lviv is about rabbis and Volyn Podolia is about Hasidim, here we're talking about modern Jewish intellectuals, modern Jewish writers. The Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik lived most of his life in Odessa. The Jewish historians Shimon Dubnov wrote and lived for a good number of years in Odessa, as did such luminaries in Zionist history as Achad Ha'am, the father of spiritual Zionism, and Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, who wrote for Odessan newspapers, and his heyday was in this city. And this group is referred to as the Chachmei Odessa, the wise men of Odessa. Odessa is a big city with over 300,000 inhabitants at the turn of the 20th century. But in those days, a third of the inhabitants of Odessa were Jewish. It was a major city by East European standards at the turn of the 20th century, where a third of the population was Jewish. I'm going to do one or two more places to round out this picture. Kharkov, the city which has been really battered very badly in this war, is a newer community I mentioned. It's a university town, an academic town, and it is famous in Jewish history for the fact that the organization known as Bilu was founded in Kharkov. Bilu is the organization of young people, the first organization to send pioneers to settle in the land of Israel in 1881. So the first practical step of the Zionist movement was taken by a group of university students, Jewish university students from Kharkov. And last but not least, there's too much to say, so it would be the capital city, Kiev. For me, a couple of, there are just, I can't go through everything, but this is almost like a personal subjective selection. For me, first of all, Kiev is the city of Sholem Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer who wrote Tevye the Dairyman. Sholem Aleichem lived most of his adult life in Kiev. He loved that city. He wrote about the city, which he nicknamed Yehupitz. And there is a statue of Sholem Aleichem, well, or at least there was. I don't know what they've done now or during the war, but there's many years now been a statue of Sholem Aleichem in downtown Kiev. Golda Meir was born in Kiev, though she quickly as a young child moved elsewhere, and there's a plaque where Golda Meir was born. If I go to more recent Jewish history, post-war Jewish history, in some ways you can say the Soviet Jewish movement for Aliyah started in Kiev. A young man named Boris Kochubievsky in 1968 wrote a public letter demanding to be allowed to leave for Israel. He wrote a little manifesto, Why I Am a Zionist, in which he wrote, I am a Jew, I want to live in the Jewish state. Is that a crime? He was arrested, he was tried, he was imprisoned. Eventually he was released and he left for Israel. But that really is the first of many such letters, many such protests, and the movement of Soviet Jewry for Aliyah, for immigrating to Israel, you could say started with Boris Kochubievsky in Kiev in 1968. With that, I'd like to move on to more recent history, because I think there's really been a shift and a change in Ukrainian Jewish relations and in Ukrainian Jewish life in the last 35 years. That is since the last years of the Soviet Union, and then since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some of this will be anecdotal, some of this will be more systematic. In 1989, the Soviet Union is sort of raveling out of control, but it's still there, and there are all kinds of movements arising. In 1989, the Jews in the Soviet Union made their first public congress of an organization they called the VAD. The first time there was a public meeting with hundreds of delegates of Jews in the Soviet Union. It hadn't been possible, well, in certainly 65 years. And these are the leaders of the VAD. This is Mikhail Chlenov from Moscow. This is Grigory Krupnikov from Riga. And they had a problem. Where are they going to get security? There were anti-Semitic groups in Moscow demonstrating, and they were very much worried about security. And they weren't going to trust the Soviet police or the KGB to provide security at this first Jewish Congress. And what they did is they turned to the Ukrainian national movement, to Ruch. Both of these movements were dissident in a sense and demanding the national rights of their groups from the Soviets, demanding change. And in fact, it was Ruch, it was the Ukrainian national movement that sent security guards to protect the very first meeting of the Jewish Congress in Moscow. That shows a different spirit than the one we think about usually when we think of Ukrainian Jewish relations. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. It dissolved in 1991. This is a big event because for many decades after World War II, from a Jewish perspective, I'm talking, of course, in world history, it's a big event. From a Jewish perspective, this is important because for many decades after World War II, the Soviet Union was an anti-Semitic state. It discriminated against Jews in employment. It vilified the Jewish religion even more than other religions. It vilified the state of Israel. And the collapse of the Soviet Union means the final end to state anti-Semitism in that part of the world. There will be anti-Semitism, there will be groups, but it's a far cry when anti-Semitism is a private matter of certain groups to when anti-Semitism is propagated and implemented by the state. And therefore, independent Ukraine is a different story than the Soviet Union. I want to point out one cultural thing that will surprise you. In the same year that the Soviet Union collapsed, 1991, a play was put on the Ukrainian stage in the Ukrainian National Theater named after Ivan Franko. And this is a play, a drama called Tevye Tevel. It's based on Shlomo Aleicham's Tevye the Dairyman. It is not Fiddler on the Roof because it is not a musical. It is only a drama. This play ended up being the longest running play in the history of modern Ukrainian theater. It went on for 21 years to packed houses. And this shows you the interest that Ukrainian audiences had in the Jewish subject and the affinity that they felt towards Tevye as a Ukrainian Jew, and that's how they perceived him, as a Ukrainian Jew, with a lot of both, again, attraction and affinity. And this, again, this doesn't represent all Ukrainians. You can't generalize about societies, but at least a certain class, those who go to theater, were really attracted and drawn to this play for more than 20 years. In 2014, there was a revolution in Ukraine against a corrupt pro-Russian government, and on behalf of Ukraine drawing closer to Europe. This is an important event, and it's important in many ways. The person who literally started this revolution, these demonstrations at the central square, at the Maidan means square. The person who started it was a Afghano-Ukrainian, Mustafa Naim. He was born in Afghanistan and then as a youngster moved to Ukraine. The reason I'm mentioning that is because this revolution was a revolution which was all-inclusive. In other words, it was initiated by an Afghan Ukraine, and it included in it also Jewish Ukrainians or Ukrainian Jews. Jewish leaders spoke from the rostrum. A rabbi said prayers from the rostrum. And I think I'm showing you there, even klezmer music, because a lot of these demonstrations had concerts and musical programs. Klezmer music was performed at Maidan. And I think Maidan is very important as far as creating a kind of civic nationalism in Ukraine, where you can be a Ukrainian regardless of your religion or regardless of your ethnicity or your language, whether you speak Ukrainian or Russian. And it is this event, 2014, that paved the way for 2019, when Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine. I consider Zelensky's election a very important event. Everybody knew he was Jewish. Everybody knows he's Jewish. That is no secret. And yet, in a democratic election, that was not the issue almost for anybody. And he won by a landslide. And what's even more important is, as I said, not only that he won, but that there was no whispering campaign or public campaign. Don't vote for Zelensky, he's a Jew. Similar things have happened in other East European countries. In Poland, in the 1990s, when there were candidates with some Jewish background, a Jewish grandparent or something, immediately there were whispering campaigns. Don't vote for him. He's not a Pole, he's a Jew. I think that in no other country in Eastern Europe could a Jewish president be elected. Of course not in Poland, and of course not in Hungary, not in Lithuania. We can go through the list. And it's an extraordinary statement about Ukrainian society that this was not an issue to this day. Now I want to move on to something about Jewish communal, my second part about Jewish communal life in Ukraine the last 30 years. Yes, there's Jewish religious life. Let's just be clear. Jewish life had to basically resurface after the Soviet years. Jewish life had been suppressed under the Soviets. Let me be clear. How many Jews are in Ukraine? A topic of great dispute. You will hear enormous numbers like 300,000. You will hear very minimalist numbers like 50,000. Some of the large numbers are sort of inflated by self-interested parties, by the chief rabbis, by UJA. There are real problems in figuring out how many Jews there are in Ukraine. The demographer in Jerusalem, Sergio de la Pergola, even he, who was a strict demographer, said somewhere between 50 and 150,000. Well, that's a big range. Part of the problem is there are people still who are reluctant to tell a census taker that they're Jewish. So there probably are more Jews than in the census. In any event, let's settle on a middle number like 100,000 in the middle of de la Pergola's estimate. That's not an insignificant Jewish community. 100,000 Jews is much more than countries, of course, than Denmark, Finland, Sweden, but also much more than Italy or Austria. So it is a sizable Jewish community, though certainly not one of the largest in the world today. It is a open Jewish community. What I mean by that is there are many Jewish organizations and they compete in the marketplace of ideas. I wanted to show you these two main synagogues because there are two chief rabbis of Ukraine. The Brodsky Synagogue is run by Chabad and Rabbi Assman. Moshe Reuven Assman is the chief rabbi there. The Podel Synagogue is of Haredi Jews, of strictly ultra-Orthodox Jews, more religious than Chabad, those with earlocks and fur hats. And the rabbi there is Rabbi Jacob Blech, who also considers himself chief rabbi of Ukraine. There are, so those are, the two largest religious groups, Chabad and the ultra-Orthodox, but there is a presence of the conservative movement. There are conservative Masorti congregations in 5 cities in Ukraine, and this is my friend, the Masorti rabbi in Kiev, Reuven Stamov. So there is, but I would say most Ukrainian Jews are not religious. They have a secular Jewish identity, a kind of ethnic Jewish identity, which is held together by many things. First of all, by things as basic and simple as their names. If you're named Gordon in Ukraine, everybody knows you're Jewish. And, Ukrainian names often end in ko, as in Poroshenko, Shevchenko, Gusenko. So everyone recognizes Gordon as a Jewish name, and Dmitry Gordon is a big media magnate, and he runs one of the top news outlets in Ukraine. If your name is Schuster, everybody knows Schuster is Jewish, and Savik Schuster ran the top TV political talk show in Kiev for many, many years. And if your name is Reznikov, everybody recognizes you're Jewish. And Alexei Reznikov is the current Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Ukraine has not only a Jewish president, but also a Jewish Minister of Defense. I'm showing you these examples also to point out that Jews pop up in many places in public life in Ukraine. It's not only the president that has a public position in Ukrainian life. Names matter because like that, because they're markers. Let me mention another thing. A big factor in Jewish identity in Ukraine is Israel. There was massive emigration of Jews from Ukraine and from Russia in the 1990s. And, you know, there are 1 million ex-Soviet Jews and their family members in Israel. The reason this matters is every Jew in Ukraine has close family and close friends in Israel. And many, many Jews from Ukraine have visited Israel, or their Israeli relatives have visited them. And it's not far, because it's from Kiev to Tel Aviv is a 3-hour flight. It's like for us going to Florida. Therefore, the ties to Israel, the concern about Israel, is very palpable and very real and very immediate, and affects Ukrainian Jews. Now, let me point out the obvious, which is, especially among the younger generation, you know, we're no longer talking about intermarriage. We're talking about people with one Jewish parent or one Jewish grandparent. There is a lot of mixed families. Intermarriage is very old in the Soviet Union. So it's very interesting to see just how many people with one Jewish grandparent will embrace their Jewish identity. They may not be halachically Jewish, but they consider themselves Jewish and are comfortable doing so. Let me give you an example of how that can happen, to be more concrete. In many places, the best Jewish kindergarten in a city or in a neighborhood happens to be the Jewish kindergarten, which is sponsored by the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC. Now it's open to anybody who wants to attend, but it's a kindergarten under Jewish auspices. And what will often happen, it's the best because they have JDC funding. They have supplies, they have good teachers, they pay decently, they have decent programming. And what will often happen is people from mixed backgrounds will say to each other, well, your mother's Jewish or your grandfather was Jewish. Why don't we send our kid to the Jewish kindergarten? It's the best one in town. We all know Jews care about education. And as a result of that, there's feedback. In other words, the child goes to that Jewish kindergarten. There'll be candles on Hanukkah, there'll be matzah on Passover, and a kind of Jewish identity is instilled to the child, who instills it to the parent. Parents who, again, may be half or even 1/4 Jewish. There are a lot of Jewish elderly in Ukraine, and the JDC has a network of institutions called cheseds that are really social service agencies for the Jewish elderly, including Holocaust survivors. But this also creates a kind of Jewish community. These people lived through the Soviet years when they couldn't meet as Jews, and now they do. Now they have Jewish programming in the chesed. So Jewish community, to finish that section up, is very different than the American Jewish community. The extremes are bigger. You know, you have the ultra-Orthodox Hasidim on one end of the spectrum, pretty sizable. A town like Uman where Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav is buried, and therefore it's a pilgrimage site for Hasidim. You know, that's basically an ultra-Orthodox city in the midst of Ukraine, where the street signs are in Hebrew, and there are literally thousands of Orthodox Jews living there. That's one extreme of Ukrainian Jewish life. And the other extreme is, of course, a significant portion of people who are 1/4 Jewish and either do or don't have that identity. So the extremes are pretty strong, but there's a whole middle. And there are lots of things happening. There's Hillel in Ukraine. There's birthright, trips to Israel. There are seminars. It is not a languishing Jewish community. Okay, now finally, some last comments about what's happening with the war. I'm sorry, this is the Jewish Community Center in Dnipro, which is the largest Jewish community center in the world. It is an enormous structure, 7 buildings, called the Menorah Center because it's got 7 buildings, and everything of the Dnipro Jewish community is there pretty much. Not only is, synagogue, but then school and yeshiva and kindergarten, a Jewish museum, a Jewish library, etc. But they also have so much space. They have a conference center and banquet halls, and a lot of general organizations use the Menorah Center for their events. Dnipro was just hit by shelling today for the first time, though not the Menorah Center itself. Okay. As far as the war, this is not a Jewish war. This is a war between Russia and Ukraine. If there is a Jewish aspect, it is the rather bizarre aspect of the Russians calling the Ukrainians Nazis when the president is Jewish. That has fallen flat on its feet. That's not gotten anywhere, accusing the Ukrainians of being Nazis. Like Ukrainian society in general, there's been a lot of flight and a lot of refugees. I think here, though, it's important to say, from what I can judge and from what I read and follow, the Jewish community, because it is so well organized and structured, there is a tremendous organized effort as far as getting Jewish refugees either away from the combat to the West or out of the country. There are bus after bus after bus. They're organized by different Israeli organizations, Ichud Hatzalah, by the Israeli government, Nativ. They're organized by Chabad, they're organized by the JDC. And I follow the Facebook groups and Telegram channels where people sign up for the buses, and it is very impressive. There's also organized Jewish efforts to extricate people, because you've got elderly and sick people who can't get out without real help. And there are groups just dealing with extricating people in difficult straits. I should point out, these Jewish organized buses almost always in the announcements say, we will take people of any ethnicity or any religion. These are not exclusively Jewish buses. And that is a tremendous, very appropriate, openness and generosity of the spirit. But getting back to the Jewish community, therefore I estimate, if 10% of Ukrainians have fled the country, are refugees, that's 4 million out of over 40 million, I'm quite confident 25 or 30% of the Jews have left the country. It can't be more than that, because men between the age of 18 and 60 have to stay in Ukraine. They're not allowed to leave the country. They have to serve between 18 and 60. So most men, unless you're elderly or a child, you're staying in Ukraine. But I think the proportion of Ukrainian Jews that have left is very high. That is a tribute to the organization and the efforts of the worldwide Jewish community and the Ukrainian Jewish community. Where are they going is a very interesting question. Of course, there's going to be a lot of aliyah. A lot of them have relatives in Israel. So a lot of them will be moving to Israel. A lot of them are moving to Germany because there's a significant Russian-speaking Jewish community in Germany. Even before this, the German Jewish community was overwhelmingly Russian-speaking Jews. And Germany has a special program to accept Jewish immigrants, which it started many years ago as a special obligation they feel to receive Jews. So many will go to Germany. The bigger question actually is not where they'll go, but whether they will stay. And that depends on multiple factors. In other words, again, in many cases, we're talking about a split family where the man has stayed in Ukraine and women and children have left it. And so the open question is, after this war is over, whenever that will be, will the husband leave to join the family in some other country, or will the wife and children leave and return to Ukraine? As I say, this is an open question. The last point I want to make about the war, oh, well, this is news literally out of today's newspaper. The Jewish theme does come up sometimes, like it did come up today in another fake news from the Russians. The Russians in general actually announced that Ukrainian nationalists exploit the Uman synagogue for military purposes, Russian brass reveals. This was announced, well, either yesterday or today. And there's Rabbi Asman from the Chabad synagogue going to Uman, the site of Rabbi Nachman's grave, and meeting the head of the Uman community, of the Bratslav community, and just, dispelling this myth that the synagogue is being used by Ukrainian forces. This synagogue building has been closed since September. You can see the gate is closed. And so every once in a while, you wonder why the Russians said that, presumably so that they would be justified in bombing the building, saying it's a military installation. That's why it was so important, and to respond so immediately to this fake news that Ukrainian forces are, utilizing the synagogue. I want to point out one last point, and then I think I'll stop and take questions. Jews are fighting in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side. And Israelis are fighting in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side. One thing that's not known is before the war broke out, there were 15,000 bearers of Israeli passports in Ukraine. Besides the indigenous Jewish community, there are 15,000 quote unquote Israelis living in Ukraine. They fall into many categories. The ultra-Orthodox are part of it. But what I want to point out is we have a false image of the former Soviet Aliyah, but they just left their countries and created a new life in Israel. And they, sort of closed the door on their previous life. This is not true for many of them. Many of them moved to Israel, and after 5 years, moved back to Ukraine, and maybe 10 years later, moved back to Israel. Many have gone back to Ukraine to make a better living. Maybe they leave their wives and children in Israel, and the man works in Ukraine and can return relatively frequently because, again, it's only a 3-hour flight. So there are, the traffic is complex, and there are Israelis, or at least Israeli citizens, living in Ukraine, and therefore there are Israelis who have joined. They have both passports, and they love both countries, and who are fighting in the Ukrainian military or in support of the Ukrainian military. This is a different example. These are two Chabad Hasidim from Dnipro, Cherkassky's father and son, who are, fighting in the Ukrainian military. So to wrap this up, I want to tell you a personal kind of story, an anecdote, which was very touching and is very fitting for this time of year. As the war broke out, I wrote to a colleague in Lviv. He's not Jewish, he's Greek Catholic, which is a Ukrainian church, the Greek Catholic Church. He's a professor, he's an important Ukrainian intellectual. And I wrote a letter of solidarity and support to him. And he wrote back and he said, David, I think you'll understand how we feel. We are like the children of Israel in the story of the Exodus. We want to flee, we want to leave, we want to be free. But Pharaoh, with his horses and his chariots, is chasing after us. And we are hoping that the Lord will save us just as he saved the children of Israel, and that Ukraine will be free. So in this time of year, which is Passover, and we think about the Exodus, we should think about this people that is struggling to be free and to create a new history with an open history, European history, in which Jews will be full-fledged members of Ukrainian society. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm happy to respond to questions.
Thank you so much, David. We're all watching the news, and there's obviously so much more to learn, and so we're especially grateful that you are here to enlighten us. I saw a few people had questions during the talk. One of them was Shelby Shapiro about Yiddish. So I don't know, David, if you want to unmute him.
Yeah, so you should be able to unmute yourself now, Shelby.
Good. I was just wondering what the state of Yiddish was in the Ukraine and amongst the frum and the secular.
Right. Thank you for asking that question. There's as my bit about Tevye Tevel implies, there's a lot of interest in Yiddish. Not only among Jews, by the way, but there's a lot of sympathy and warm feeling about Yiddish in Ukraine. I'll give you an example. Literally just before the war, Ukraine celebrated a holiday called Mother Tongue Day, Native Tongue Day. Of course, that was mainly about celebrating the Ukrainian language, but Jews organized the program on Mother Tongue Day for Mamalosh and for Yiddish. To say, we're Jews and we have a mother tongue too. And there are Yiddish courses at Kiev Mahila Academy University and other places. There's been Yiddish instruction in Ukraine. I would say fluency in Yiddish is rather rare. Elderly people remember it. I mean, elderly for me means 80 plus. But it's rather rare. So I would say emotionally, it's very important to them. And they all know 2 or 3 Yiddish songs, which is probably 1 or 2 more than most American Jews. So they all know a couple Yiddish songs. They have I think it's closer to them than maybe for American Jews. But fluency is pretty much gone, except for the ultra-Orthodox, and they're bringing the language in from Israel. And but there's been a lot of translation of Yiddish literature into Ukrainian lately, and a couple of excellent translators. In other words, they very much feel it's part of their heritage.
Okay, I saw that Sarah Levine had a question.
Thank you so much, Professor Fishman, for this talk. And just two quick questions. One is sort of probably as your typical Ashkenazi American Jew, it is very hard and surprising to kind of hear your take on the kind of positive relationship between the Jewish community and Ukrainians. You know, there's so much literature about the Holocaust of bullets and the incredible violence, you know, that, you know, often academics have recovered the neighbor on neighbor and the local participation of, you know, within a small village who knew the Jews but participated, although it was, you know, obviously instigated by the Nazis. And so I just would like to understand a little bit more. I mean, I think of the writings of Father Patrick Dubois, who has done a lot to bring, at least to Americans. And I was curious your take on that. Is that too harsh? I mean, he talks about the local neighbors celebrating, bringing, you know, that the killing of the Jews in the village were known to the locals, but, you know, they brought their chefs and their cook, there was music, and they really participate in their education. So I would love to understand your more positive perspective.
Okay, Sarah. Well, first of all, I wouldn't deny any of that. There's Western Ukraine during World War II, and there's Eastern Ukraine during World War II. In Western Ukraine, and I'm sorry if I'm getting geographically complex, you know, which had been under Polish rule before the war, the things you described really happened. And I alluded to them. But, the problem is American Jews have heard these terrible stories, which are all true, from Polish Jews who went through them. And that's a very important part of our memory as American Jews. We've heard from Polish survivors about Ukrainians, collaborators and murderers and so on. What we haven't internalized, because that's not part of our experience, is the stories of Soviet Jews who know very well the Ukrainians from Eastern Ukraine, where again, 1.5 million Ukrainians died in the Red Army. That hasn't even had, you know, even a dent in American Jewish consciousness. You probably think I'm lying because it's so implausible to us as Jews. So are we only going to look at certain Ukrainians and not look at other Ukrainians? That's not balanced. That's not fair. That's just feeding into our, forgive me for saying this, into our bigotry. So it's a complicated story, World War II. And Zelensky is very important because there are Ukrainians that have glorified the Ukrainian nationalists during World War II and see them as heroes, fighters for Ukrainian independence. They don't glorify them for murdering Jews. They deny that they murdered Jews, but still they're glorifying the people who murdered Jews. Zelensky has taken the historical narrative in a different direction. Zelensky comes from Eastern Ukraine, and he's, you know, not done that. Of course, no Jew can do that. No, and really talked about the tragedy of Ukrainian history. But I would, to get back to the point, and that's very important, but still to get back to the point, let's not see half the story or even a quarter of the story. Let's see the whole story, and then we'll have a different picture.
Are there any members of the audience who would like to ask a question who have not wrote anything into the chat? Let me just see. Nathan Hershkowitz. David, you want to unmute him?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Yes, it's Nissan. It's Nathan. Thank you, Sharon. My question is, I have several, but I don't want to take up too much time. First, about Transnistria. Are you familiar with the area known as Transnistria in World War II? My father was in Lager over there, And I don't consider the grandchildren of those people who tortured them there any more guilty than the grandchildren of Germans. These are different people, etc. But I simply want to know if the area that's today known as Transnistria is the same area.
No, I don't think it's exactly the same area. The Transnistrovyan Republic, which is this puppet regime of Russia now. I don't think it's the same area, no.
The Transnistria Republic of today is from land that Moldova claims?
Correct,
Or it's sort of on the border of Ukraine and Moldova, and that's what's confusing to me.
correct, correct. It's a breakaway territory from Moldova, basically allied with Russia. You know,
Thank
Russia's done this in many places. Okay.
My follow-up question,
Oops, you're muted. You're muted. I can't hear you. David, you got to unmute the gentleman. You can't unmute yourself, Nathan? Oh, there you are.
yes, I'm okay now, thanks. You mentioned elderly people like who speak Yiddish. My question is, as you know, of course, the culture of Eastern Galicia and areas like Lemberg, Lvov, Chernovitz, now known as Chernovice, which is northern Bukovina, well, that's a different area. That's already Moldova is Kishinev and Bessarabia. But speaking of Western Ukraine, the Uzhgorod, Munkach area, which was Slovakia. My question is, are there people who still have memories and affiliation to that culture? For example, Chernovitz was a German-speaking city. As you know, it was the most eastern part of the Austrian Empire, and Franz Josef made the University of Chernovitz there, as you know all about YIVO, etc. Chernovitz was a city 1/3 Jewish, and they were German speaking. So, is there any traces from your own anecdotal, experience, personal experiences? Have you found traces of Galician culture in places like Lvov, or if you visited Chernovtsi, traces of Bukovinian culture, and in Uzhgorod, which I believe Uzhgorod is part of Ukraine. I'm not sure from the map. It's near the border. Have you found traces, and are there people who still have affinity to that interwar culture, which had nothing to do with Ukraine?
Well, Nathan, I'm very impressed. I'm trying to simplify, and you are revealing the entire complexity. Yes, as you're pointing out, these are literally, all these places are in Western Ukraine, but they're literally 3 different regions, right? As you pointed out, Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia. Western Ukraine is ethnically very complex history. And you're right, in Jewish history, these are different regions. And I didn't want to complicate everybody's life by going into that. There is some traces. They're aware of it, So in Lviv, there is in the Jewish Community Center, there is a Galician Jewish Museum. They know about Galicia, and it's not only a Lviv Jewish Museum, it's a Galician Jewish Museum. And in Chernovtsi, they've created a museum of the Jews of Bukovina. So they are aware and trying to connect to their regional legacy. I haven't been to Uzhgorod. I can't refer to that. But there are very few people that literally go back to that by now. First of all, a lot of them are in Israel and here in America. So they're literally, individuals, but they've heard from their parents and grandparents about the Germanness of Chernovitz, or about the peculiar character of Galiciana. So the memory lives on, definitely.
I think we'll take one more question. Marina, did you want to ask that question?
Oh, you already discussed it. I was just asking about Carpathia, Ruthenia, that was part of Czechoslovakia between the First and Second World War, and then after 1945 has since been part of the Ukraine, and you hadn't mentioned it up until just
Okay,
a
but
minute ago.
Nathan helped me mention it. Okay, great. Yes, maybe in the next time I give a talk, I should say something about Chernovitz and something about Uzhgorod. The borders have shifted a lot in this part of the world. And, yes, many of these regions are now Ukraine's, but historically were something else.
Okay, what I ask my students, any burning questions?
Well, I see Joshua Fogel. Let's take Joshua
Okay.
Fogel and then we'll wrap it up. You better have a good question, Joshua. I can't hear you. So far, it's not good because you're muted. Okay.
Okay, so I hope it's a good question. It's probably unique. I'm a professor at Burton College, but in the business management department. I studied with your father, your late father, the famous Joshua Fishman at Yeshiva University. And what I wanted to know, he has a lot of yichus in case people don't know, in addition to obviously your own career. But did in any way your father influence your connection with Ukrainian Jewish culture? And how?
It's a personal question. Not
Well, that's
directly.
what I figured, unique.
Yeah, not directly. Again, maybe a little bit, but it's really about my father's mother, who I showed the slide at the beginning, because she was from there. And then, but maybe the biggest, besides my grandmother, the biggest influence was traveling there and spending time with people. And I will admit that I spent more time with academic people who tend to be educated and therefore somewhat more liberal minded. In other words, the Ukrainians I meet are not peasants, but I meet cab drivers and I meet, women in the marketplace selling tomatoes. So I do get an opportunity to see different parts of Ukrainian society. I just want to stress my basic point one more time. Progress is never linear. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Everybody knows about Ukrainian anti-Jewish violence. What people don't know, and which I wanted to stress, is mainly that the last 35 years have seen significant changes. And if we're going to stick to our stereotypes from 80 years ago, we're going to miss the changes that have happened in the last 35 years. Now, that doesn't guarantee no society is perfect. Hey, look at our society. But we have to look at things realistically. And a society that elected a Jewish president, that's just one indicator, is not a society infused with anti-Semitism.
Okay, so we are
Okay,
going to.
thank you.
Yeah, and we're going to take this opportunity to thank Professor Fishman. If you have other questions, you can email us. So we're all thanking Professor Fishman, and we are very happy that you took the time to attend the lecture.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.